Commander Lydia Voss and her exploration team stumble upon an enormous derelict ship floating in space, containing hundreds of hibernating apex predators that start to awaken once the humans board their ship. They narrowly escape by burning the ship into a star and come to a stark realization about humanity's doomed place in a universe that's full of ancient, intelligent predators. Commander Lydia Voss had spent 17 space years sailing the expanse between stars, but never had she encountered anything like what she discovered drifting out there in the bleak and terrible emptiness of the Kepler 442 system. The derelict ship showed on her long-range scanners as a murder ship built from the nightmares of humanity. POC marked with micrometeorite scars and damaged by solar radiation. It lazily spun through the inky blackness between two dead stars. The sheer scale of the ship was enormous, at least 3 times the length of her exploration ship, the Meridian. It didn't seem like anything in the colonial database leak predatory, with jagging spines that reminded Lydia of some kind of deep-sea creature she'd once seen in Earth's archives. The hull was unmarked, no registry numbers, nothing to indicate where it came from or what it was for. It just kind of was a monument to the unknown drifting in the cosmic boneyard. The rest of Lydia's crew were 3 men. Dr. Marcus Chen was an exonobiologist who let his curiosity get the better of his judgment most days. Technician Riley Harper, 25 and nervy as a wet cat. If you could interpret alien diagrams, then Harper was your man. Navigator Jacques Santorgi's an old hand at space, who'd seen more derelicts than anyone save maybe the alphabet Buddhists. Together they comprised the most successful pair of explorers in the Colonian Survey Division. Regulations on the discovery and reporting of unknown vessels were explicit. Unknowns were to be immediately reported to Colonial Command, but they were 3 months away from the closest relay station, and the derelict's energy signature didn't match any in their databases. This might be discovery of the century, the sort of find that would get them into the history books. Jackson said what? The rest of them were thinking, Command will not receive our transmission for weeks. By the time they get a proper expedition out here, this thing could have floated into the star's gravity well. We have maybe a month before it goes away forever. Dr. Chen was already conducting preliminary scans, his excitement apparent. The materials are incredible, Lydia. Some sort of biometallic hybrid that I've never seen before. The whole hull seems grown, not built, and there's more weak life signs. Riley glanced up from her board, her young face concerned. Life signs? After all this time, how is that possible? Lydia examined the readings, her thoughts whirling, with the possibilities. The ship had been floating for 100 years, at minimum, maybe longer. Nothing could last that long in the void without enormous life support systems. And what scans they could do showed very low power output from the derelict. It could be automated systems, she said at last. Maintenance drones, possibly even AI constructs. Until we get aboard her, we don't know. She felt it as a heavy burden upon her. Her crew was her charge as commander above all else. But the promise of discovery, of learning secrets that could advance human understanding of the universe, was too vast to pass up, and for the next 6 hours they probed the derelict from all angles. They could tell from the shape of the ship that it was for long-range exploration like their own, but it was modified in such a way. It indicated it was for more than just survey work. Along the interior corridors were odd pods, the size of human bodies looping around in a macabre circulatory system throughout the ship. The boarding team would be Lydia and Riley, while Marcus and Jackson stayed on the Meridian and maintained surveillance on the ground. Normally they had strict protocols about minimal interaction during first contact with unknown technology, but Lydia had a feeling that wasn't going to be the case with this mission. Their airlock sealed with a soft hiss, and Lydia felt again the comforting resistance of the environmental suit as they traversed the void between ships. The derelict's airlock was enormous, built for creatures larger than humans. However, it accepted Riley's electronic prods rather smoothly. It's like it's trying to get us to come aboard, Riley said over the com. You don't see a very strict security here, almost hospitable. What I saw was the inside of the ship. Dim bioluminescent panels blinked on and off to the rhythm of a heartbeat, and the walls had a gently swelling motion that hinted at the whole craft being somehow alive. The architecture was organic and flowed with curved, twisting arteries that branched into hallways. They proceeded further into the ship and followed the central corridor to what the scans showed as the main living quarters. Silence was significant. It was a mere whisper of their breathing masks and a hum of aged machinery that had run idle for years, though without that hum the emptiness would have been deafening. The first pod they spotted was transparent, packed tight with a viscous amber liquid that clouded whatever was inside. The scanner readout Riley was getting was absurd colossal bioelectric activity, intricate neural patterns, another something that made her hands tremble even as she got a reading. "Commander," she whispered in hushed, awe-filled terror. "This isn't just alive, it's dreaming." Lydia moved nearer to the pod, shining her headlamp into the amber liquid to get a better look at the creature inside. It was like nothing they'd found in the colonial databases, humanoid in its broad structure but wrong in every detail. Its legs were too long, its chest too narrow, and its head shaped as though it was not meant for thinking but for hunting. Most chilling were its hands, with fingernails tapering into claws that could rend human flesh and bone. "Marcus, are you getting this?" Lydia turned on her helmet camera and sent images back to the Meridian. The replies were instant and full of enthusiasm. "Incredible. The patterns of neural activity don't indicate mere consciousness, but complex dream states. It's a being that has been in a kind of suspended animation that lasts decades, possibly centuries." They went from pod to pod, capturing each resident. They differed in size and details of appearance, but all had the same predatory appearance. Long skulls, strong muscles, and those awful claws. Some were obviously larger than other sleepers, boasting more aggressive hunting features and neural patterns hinting at greater intelligence. "It's a crew," Lydia realized. "Stop tappering your word Husan as if nothing with which to throw it but, or even to wrap things in, surrounded it, such as have I, shutting up my mouth right quick with culpate as your monkey sounders do. His with booby utter it, to a pert toff. That Flossie's monkey he we can simply say exists, and that only of him, although freely formed, added to a doubt is Whiting more. Is he not Whiting more? End of footnote. But aren't there different specializations, a different rank or caste? This is their ship, and they're all asleep." Riley's scanner beeped at another reading. "Commander, I'm reading enormous power spikes from the ship's core. Something's changing." The bioluminescent panels pulsated more rapidly and the air heated up perceptibly. The sounds of awakening systems reverberated throughout the ship that had laid silent for generations. A great beast finally stretching its limbs. "We have to return to the Meridian," Lydia shot back, but as she said it, she knew it was already too late. The airlock they'd come through was locked, and Riley's efforts to override it found themselves stymied by systems that seemed suddenly far more complex than they'd originally seemed. Waking up, Marcus spat the words over the cum, his panic practically seeping through. "All of them, the neural patterns are changing from inactive to active. You've got to get out of there now." The first pod emptied, amber fluid sluicing through chutes in the floor toward some central recycler. The creature inside it grew suddenly restless, and its limbs stretched with the smoothness of a predator waking from slumber. Its eyes sprang to life, pupils expanding immediately to lock on Lydia and Riley. "Move." Lydia gave Riley a shove toward what seemed to be a maintenance access, and the young tech lost her footing, spilling her gear onto the organic floor. The thing in the pod made a sound that was half raw, half something else, a hunting cry that was answered by rustling in dozens of other pods across the ship. They raced through hallways which seemed to grow and alter around them, the living body of the ship itself becoming activated with the recovery of the crew, and they heard the cracking of emptying pods impacting and the sound of the creatures now out of the pods, and hunting cries that reminded them of intelligence and teamwork. Riley's scanner was pinging up life signs all over the ship, and they were all up now, all active, and all moving with intent. "There are hundreds of them," she panted when they stopped at a crossroads. "How could they have all been in here?" The response came when they reached an immense chamber that doubled the distance the lights could reach. Pods were stacked against every wall, floor to ceiling. In such a complicated matrix, it seemed to represent something more than storage, some social hierarchy or something. The bigger pods formed the core, and their occupants, obviously, the alpha predators of this scary bunch. "It's a colony ship," Lydia breathed. "But not for colonization, for hunting." One of the middle pods was open already, with its occupant absent. The thing that came out of it was huge and stood nearly 3 meters height, faced with features that spoke of intelligence and an unblemished mastery of violence. Its head twisted to look in their direction in one jerky motion, and when it smiled, the sight was more chilling than any snarl. This was their leader, their apex predator, and it had dreamed of the hunt for many decades. Riley's cry stunned through the room as smaller beings plummeted from the ceiling, tight in the maneuvers of a pack that had chased game together for thousands of years. They were not just predators, they were military, organized and deadly. The other took the lead. Its hollow voice was a bass murmur issuing from the walls. They were words in no language Lydia recognized, but their meaning was unmistakable. They were prey, and the hunt was on. They discovered a maintenance shaft that extended to the outer hull, slithering through apertures barely large enough to accommodate a human being. While the sounds of pursuit neared, the creatures were familiar with their ship, sliding through corridors that were not printed on any schematic, availing themselves to its living processes as a way to follow their quarry. The ship's giving them a hand, Riley noticed. It's not just alive, it's intelligent. It's been waiting for them to wake up. They stepped out into another corridor, this one flanked by what seemed to be trophy cubes. There was a different artifact in each case, weapons, tools, and objects that manifestly hailed from dozens of different species. For centuries, the beings had been traversing the galaxy, hunting and picking up souvenirs of their kills. The opposite end of the corridor held a viewing chamber with large windows which gazed out into the void. The Meridian was in the distance, and even while they watched, the rust bucket ship started to move, its engines made of organic components coming to life, sounding like a giant's heart-pounding Traxon Vamos. Lydia yelled into her come, but all she heard was static. The ship was blocking their communications, cutting them off from their crew. The scout appeared at the end of the corridor with a dozen prowlers behind it. It glided with the effortless economy of a hunter so perfected that it no longer needed to try its digit spread, and its eyes fixed on Lydia with a cunning that was almost human in its math. That it spoke once more, and this time Lydia understood it. I don't mean the words, but the meaning. It was about the hunt, the etiquette these beings observed as they hunted their victims through the hulls of their ship. They could flee, they could hide, they could resist, but they would ultimately be captured. It was only long in coming, but it had taken Lydia 17 years in the void to know. One thing for certain, survival wasn't always about creating a better system than the people who'd put you there, but about comprehending the system better than the people who built it. The ship was alive, but it was a machine too, and machines had their weaknesses. The pods, she whispered to Riley. The hibernation system. If we can get at the focal point, maybe we can push them back into sleep. It was a desperate strategy, but it was all they had. The control center was 3 stories above, down halls that were now full of hunting creatures. But the maintenance shafts could be possible. They skulked through the ship's arteries, walking conduits that throbbed to the beat of the ship's heart. Behind them, the things had split into groups, their cries a cacophony of metal and meat, as they bore their delving in unison. The central control room was a feat of bioengineering that rivaled all others, its walls lined with neural interfaces that were a great, pulsing brain. The hibernation was in the ship's living systems, so the system mechanics would need knowledge not just of the tech, but of the human body as well. Riley scrambled while Lydia covered the doors, her contingency weapon placed by ready but useless, against creatures who'd thrived in the void for decades. The mechanisms of the ship were more advanced than anything humans had ever imagined, but Riley's xeno-design intuition allowed him to interpret the alien designs and to start piecing together how the stasis tech worked. Got it, she yelled, but before she even finished, the doors to the room were swarming with beings. The leader followed, its monstrous body blocking the entrance as it gazed upon them with what was perhaps respect. Hibernation sequence initiated, and the fluid in the pods throughout the ship started to circulate and fill. But the creatures did not just roll over and die, they fought the system. Their superior biology enabled them to resist the chemical sleep that had held them captive for so long. The leader stepped forward, his claws out, and Lydia knew that it was all over. The beings were too evolved, too smoothly integrated into the systems of their ship. They'd finished their hunt, and then they'd come for the Meridian. But Riley had one more trick. Because pinpointing the hibernation controls, she'd discovered something else: the ship's navigation system. In seconds, she'd maneuvered to the autopilot, sending it on a course into the nearest star. The chief bellowed in anger, realizing at once what had transpired. It lunged forward, but the ship's inertia made it stagger. What hibernation system and gravity from their new course finally acted. And one by one, their bodies gave way beneath the double attack of the chemical slumber and the mounting pressure of gravity. The leader went down last, its eyes fixed on Lydia and holding a vow of future retribution. The pod was minimally operational, its controls too tailored to the creatures, and too crude for human use, but it would get them to the Meridian, assuming Jackson could intercept their course before they moved beyond the range of rescue. They cruised away from the foundering vessel, watching through the plasteel hull as it was swallowed by the stars. Corona, its monstrous burden consumed within. The animals might live through the heat, they would have already lived through impossible conditions, but they would be stuck in the star's gravity well forever. The report to Colonial Command would be sanitized, naturally. A deserted, unknown origin craft disbanded to avoid the risk of local space contamination. The truth would be need-to-know, highly classified knowledge. One of those things for which you'd had to have been there, yes. Humanity was not alone in the universe, and no, not all intelligence was kind. But Lydia would remember. She noted the intelligence in those predatory eyes, the coordination of their hunt, and the terrible beauty of a species that had converted killing into an art form. They had been explorers once, maybe, before they had become something else altogether. The rescue had taken 12 hours, and during that time Lydia and Riley had waited in the cramped pod, staring at the star that had become a burial ground for an entire race of warriors. There was nothing on the Meridian scanners to confirm the presence of the dead ship. Nothing there to indicate that it had ever been at all but the readings in their personal scanners. Marcus was entranced by the biological information they were gathering. Jackson, however, grasped the implications more than anyone. There might be more of them out there, he whispered. That kind of ship crews in hibernation, waiting for the moment to wake up. Riley had been silent since their escape, her youthful face aged by the experience, and the hard work also that went with it. Some of them were not only hunting, she finally said, they were searching, looking for something specific. Lydia knew she was right. The creatures had been moving with some sort of purpose, tracking a path through space that was more than mere chance. They'd been searching for something, and their hibernation was a means of maintaining themselves until they found it. The question that haunted her was whether they had gotten whatever they had been looking for, or whether it was still out there, waiting for the next crew of human explorers, brave or stupid, enough to poke around on some derelict vessel adrift in the void between stars. When Lydia was a new sector commander, training new explorers in the field, she would tell them about how important it was to follow protocol, to report discoveries as soon as you made them, never to take an unnecessary risk. But she would not tell them about that ship full of sleeping predators, or of the intelligence whose gaze had raked her with such calculating hunger. There were certain truths that were too dangerous to tell, even to those who had to know. The universe was a big place, with grand wonders and indescribable horrors, the likes of nightmares with angelic faces, who offered gifts with far too steep a price for one to pay. But Riley had never forgotten, and as she rose in the chain of command of the Colonial Survey Division, she took with her the memory of creatures that had made survival an art form and exploration a hunt. She had new protocols to implement, new safety measures to put in place, new strategies for dealing with the unknown if it was going to protect fellow researchers from the darkness between the stars. The abandoned craft had vanished with her crew, sealed within and exterminated by the fires of the stars, but its memory had been preserved in the cautious procedures that protected mankind from the hunters of the dark. And occasionally, during the uneasy lulls between missions, Riley would brood upon whether the creatures had been attempting to say something in those moments, prior to the hibernation system wresting them away. Maybe they'd been on about something worse, something that could make an apex predator-infested ship seem like a minor threat. Maybe their search had not been one of hunger, but a search for protection, in a universe with an unknown set of logical, vast and complex beings that terror caused humans to leave the world, never to return. And the stars kept their secrets, and it was still dawning on mankind that some doors were better left unopened, some mysteries better left unsolved. But the quest to discover was as powerful as ever, to go beyond the known, and in every discovery, every new world, every new life form they met the lesson of what that abandoned vessel had taught once again, that the universe was much, much weirder and more life-threatening than anyone had ever conceived. Commander Lydia Voss had retired from active service 5 years after the incident, but she had never stopped looking at the stars, wondering what other ships could be floating in the void, what other crews might be in amber slumber, waiting for the moment when the time was right, and they could wake up and continue their ancient chase. The Colonial Survey Division had thousands of reports on abandoned ships, most of which had been as thoroughly investigated and filed in order, but a handful remained mysteries, with unknown origins and unclear purposes, and at the back of Lydia's mind, she knew there was always the possibility that one of those might harbor a pod full of sleeping animals, just waiting for the next group of adventurers to find their dead husks. The cosmos was great, and mankind had only just begun to understand its secrets. But one thing was clear, they were not alone, and not all of their neighbors were friendly. The abandoned ship had shown them surviving, and the void took more than technology and guts. It took wisdom, caution, and the humility to know that some discoveries were too perilous to explore. A legend had developed about the Derelict, a horror story that was familiar to every spacer in the human fleet and had entered the cores of every training academy and briefing room in human-occupied space. But the reality was still classified, and only available to those who had been there, who had looked into the intelligence behind those raptor eyes and realized that the opening of the human race's expansion into the stars had not only caught the attention of things which were older and wiser, and infinitely nastier than the human race had ever dreamed of, but the search went on. But human beings now knew that they weren't the sole hunters in the galaxy, and the dark between the stars held other ships, other crews at rest, other nightmare constructs ready to awaken and serve their ancient functions. The derelict ship had vanished into the void, but it had passed on its legacy, a habit of moving carefully and silently, wary eyes and ears, with a way to run when the next ship full of predators still sleeping awoke and moved among the stars. Riley was one of the most respected safety officers in the Colonial Survey Division, and her protocols and procedures would save lives countless times as humanity's exploration of the galaxy pushed into new quarters. But she never forgot the sensation of being stalked through the passages of a living ship, never forgot that mind that had regarded her with such calculating patience. The escape pod that transported them to freedom was eventually repaired and placed on permanent display in the Colonial Museum as a symbol of human ingenuity and bravery in the face of the unknown. But the tourists who admired its basic form and rough textures never learned the real story of its one single trip or realized that it had been their salvation in a cosmos with monsters well beyond their worst imaginary fears. And sometimes in the silence between missions, when the stars were just a touch brighter and the nothing seemed emptier, Riley would remember the pack leader, how it had looked at her in a way that could have been respect, how the pack leader had struggled against the hibernation system even as the ship piloted it to death. There was intelligence there, and purpose, and a sort of nobility that made their defeat look more like a tragedy than a triumph. The universe was a place filled with beauty and nightmares in equal measure, and humanity's expansion to the stars was only just beginning. But the knowledge gained from the derelict would lead them through the night, a lesson that would echo the survival of the fittest, not only in terms of bravery and machinery. It took wisdom and not a little caution, humility to know that they weren't the big children in the galaxy that the search went on, but not they knew they were not the sole hunters. And in the great emptiness outside, between the stars, other ships crouched in stillness, other crews slept, and other nightmares gathered themselves up to return to wakefulness and resume their eons-old mission. The derelict ship was no more, but its memory remained in the cautious tread of humanity as it spread throughout the stars, always watching, always listening, always preparing to flee when the next ship of sleeping hunters sliced out of the void. The stars were keeping their secrets close, and humanity was only just now coming to understand that there were worlds beyond the one where they'd been born, doors that maybe should never have been opened, mysteries that maybe should never have been solved. But the desire to go places, to keep pushing back the limits of the known, was as great as ever, and with each revelation, with each new world, each strange species they encountered, Louis would remember his lesson from the derelict ship. The universe was stranger and deadlier than anything the human mind could fathom. Commander Lydia Voss let out a long breath of relief as her crew managed to survive their experience with the slumbering man-eaters, knowing then that living in the void took more than just expertise and courage. It took wisdom to understand when retreat was the only option, the humility to acknowledge that humanity was not the apex predator in the galaxy, and the caution to treat the unknown with respect, rather than hubris. The abandoned ship was no more consumed by the fire of the stars, together with its dark cargo, but its existence lived on in the stat sheets and procedures which kept other navigators free of the horror that slumbered in the void of space. And occasionally, as they drifted through the void between missions, those who had been there would glance up at the stars and think to themselves over their speechless cups of recap what other ships might be out there, what other crews might be asleep in amber dreams, waiting as they had for the next gang of explorers to stumble upon them and break them free from their age-old slumber.